This is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. Cambridge University voted this week to reject guidelines on being respectful because of fears that it would limit freedom of expression. This follows the row over the sacking of an Eton teacher for expressing misogynistic views and the issue of whether players should take the knee at football matches. Critics claim that the so-called counterculture, especially surrounding sensitive issues of race and gender, is making it impossible for some people to express their views. So, does free speech still exist in the UK? And is it under threat? Joining me to discuss that are the journalist and author Ella Whelan and the contributing editor at Novara Media, Ash Sarkar. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. What do you think, Ella? Is free speech under threat in this country?
I think it's alive and well, but we need to up the defence of it, because I think that there is a tendency now to resort to a kind of you can't say that approach when faced with difficult situations or opposing views. And that's happened in a kind of a strange way, because the difficult thing about defending free speech is you're often having to defend the free speech of people that you really don't like. And some of the incidences of censorship have been things that you really wish people might not have said. But you have to stick to a principle of no ifs and no buts around this, because the interesting thing is it's not a left or right issue. This is really happening across the board, where we're, I think, taking freedom for granted. And if you want to launch any kind of progressive change in politics, the starting point is always to have a free and open debate about the issue, because that only from that point can you convince people of your argument.
But let's just talk about freedom. When you say freedom, does that mean that if you say offensive things, you should be immunised against the consequences? You shouldn't face consequences?
Well, it depends what those consequences are. So I think if you say something offensive freely, you should be well prepared for people to come back on you on that in any way they see fit. That's the exchange of ideas. You have a bit of a row. Sometimes things get nasty, but the consequences shouldn't be to be silenced. I think that talking broadly now, the trend seems to be that any time someone voices an offensive view or allegedly offensive view, if someone, for example, I get called offensive a lot of the time for criticising certain strands of contemporary feminism, but the consequence should not be to silence the person that you disagree with, but to argue back, or if you're feeling lazy, ignore them. So it depends on the consequences that you're talking about.
Ash, what do you think? Do you think certain viewpoints should be closed down?
No, I don't believe that things should be closed down as such. I do believe in healthy debate, and I do also believe that one of the things we all have the right to do as citizens is push for social changes, which means that what we consider to be socially acceptable changes over time. What we consider to be socially acceptable in terms of how we talk about gay people has changed a huge amount in the past decades. And that's because people who occupy minority positions really pushed for that. And I think that's good. I think that's healthy. I think that's democratic. When it comes to the specific issue of universities, I say this as someone who teaches in one. I think we're all too old to be obsessing over what goes on amongst students and campuses. But the way I see my role as a lecturer is twofold. The first is to facilitate difficult and challenging discussions amongst my students. That's my job. I have to present them with challenging ideas, even ones that I don't believe in. And the second is to create an environment which is welcoming, which makes sure that there isn't discrimination. In my own cohort of students, I've got people from the LGBT community, people from lots of different cultures, and it's making sure that they understand that their identity and who they are is welcome. It's not just tolerated, we want you here. And that also that there will be robust debate. And I think a good teacher can do all of those things. It's very rare that I think that these free speech moral panics is actually about how you do that as an educator. Instead, what it's trying to do is turn campuses into a battleground for the culture wars in order to advance a very reactionary agenda, which, far from protecting dissent, is actually about closing it down.
I mean, what about this Eton schoolmaster who put online and encouraged his pupils to look at a lecture about the patriarchy, which many people would regard as misogynistic, and has ultimately lost his job. But do you think that's the right thing, Ash?
Well, I can only imagine what it would be like to be at Eton's HR department. I mean, you'd be a lot better paid than me. But I imagine it's quite frustrating for them to see the agenda being set by only one side of the story. The institution, of course, has their hands tied a bit more in terms of what they can say about the situation. As an educator, you've got a responsibility to make sure that what you present to your students is credible. As much as anything else. So it's not just about, is this opinion offensive or not? Students, of course, should be presented with challenging and offensive material. This question of credibility, I think, is really key. So if, as a tutor, I decide what I want to do is to, introduce my students to some completely debunked ideas and go, well, actually, it's a freedom of speech issue. Not really. I'm actually being bad at my job.
I mean, he seems to be actually quite successful from the Etonians I know in indoctrinating them with his opinions. Do you think he should have been sacked, Ella?
Well, I'm not a lecturer, mere mortal that I am. I suppose I don't have the experience that Ash has. But the question of the Eton video is that, it's an ignorant view of women as being defined by a kind of biologically deterministic schema. So it's, I would have quite liked to have showed the kids it and then had someone, start a discussion about it. Because as it happens, Laura Bates spoke there a number of years ago, and a biologically determinist view of women is rather popular, not just by, idiots like Will Noland, but by many contemporary feminists. So I think I think always the emphasis should be on how can we facilitate free and open debate. And when it comes to, kids are a bit different, but when it comes to students at a university, my approach is always to have a hands-off approach, which is that the free speech policy that was going to be implemented wasn't just objectionable because it was about trying to shove the idea of respect down everyone's throats, which is, a bit insulting. But it's because any time you try and put a policy around these things, what you're saying is that the university, or in wider life, the state, has to micromanage how people relate to each other. As a student, I don't think you should be worried about how your identity is accepted, outside of the realms of everyone being a decent and nice person. You should be more worried about getting an education, maybe getting involved in politics, maybe challenging yourself. And so I think the emphasis always is, it's a bit disingenuous to call this a freedom of speech moral panic, because I can range off a list of examples where people are being censored. Clare College at Cambridge is trying to oust, I don't know if they've succeeded, they're trying to oust a porter for disagreeing with a view on trans in his role as a counsellor. So, this is a serious issue. Freedom is a serious issue. And I think that it's still alive and well. But what we need to do is call out the places where censorship happens and reassert a belief in people as robust individuals, students and adults.
Where does no platforming fit into this? Denying people with views, maybe people on the extreme right, maybe Islamists, whatever, denying them a platform. Where does that fit in your view?
I mean, so for me, the ability to disinvite someone is also a political freedom. I don't think it should always be done. I do think that sometimes there is a tendency to say an idea is taboo rather than, actually trying to persuade people and advance the cause of social justice. But I think it's an absurd position to take. And this is what some of the, people at Cambridge are sort of taking, which is that once you invite someone, you are morally obligated to keep inviting them, that you can't disinvite them, no matter what kind of political activity is going on. And I actually think that the right to politically organise through open letters or through protests to say, hang on, this person isn't a good person to invite. Maybe they are a Holocaust denier. Maybe they have incredibly regressive views on homosexuality. That is also a political right. That is a right to dissent. And the role of a university, the role of, any kind of democratic community is to work out who's got the stronger case. I just want to come back to...
Listen, I know there's one thing you do want to talk about, and since free speech is here, I don't think it's a free speech issue, but you said you wanted to talk about retinol serum, and seems to be a lot of people who agree with that. I don't know what the issue is. Could you just tell us?
It's, it's about how skincare has changed my life. I got a really cheap cleanser for about £4, and I now use retinol every night. And look at this glow. I wasn't born like this. I bought it. And you could have this glow too, for the low price of like a £4.
I think I've probably broken all the Ofcom rules with advertising, but we're not specifying a brand. Thank you both very much indeed.